I want to welcome everybody. Good morning. It's a treat to have us together for Psalm 18, a lengthier psalm than any that we've seen until now at 51 verses. It's not, by the way, the longest psalm among the 150 psalms. It's number 4. The longest psalm is Psalm 119, which is 176 verses, which is all the more surprising in that the Psalms we've been reading have been on average about 10 verses, some as short as 5. So today's 51 is distinctive. It's the longest psalm among the first 72 psalms. It's also unique in that it's the only psalm that appears elsewhere in the Bible, specifically in the second book of Samuel, chapter 22. It's almost identical, but circle the word almost. They're not exactly the same. And the differences between the two psalms is material for commentary. And we'll take a look at some of those differences. In fact, my goal is to spend 2 days on Psalm 18, largely so that we can look at David in the book of Samuel. That's again where this psalm is also presented as a song of victory. And that prompted me to want to look more closely in my preparation for where are the places in the second book of Samuel and the first book of Samuel where David is both musician, that's the first book of Samuel, and king in the second book, with a number of different prayers and conversations with God. So tomorrow, I will spend more time on David as king who sings to God in the book of Samuel, which is more history-based than the book of Psalms, which are a collection of his prayers. With that said, this particular psalm, not unlike the others we have shared, depends in interpretation a lot on the choice of tense. Are David's descriptions of the past? Are they descriptions of the present or of the future? This psalm I entitle Soaring Deliverance. And I like the word soaring because there's an image of God on a cherub flying through the air. And the focus, of course, not unlike other psalms, but more so here, is that of God as deliverer. This particular psalm has a very specific historical moment that it's introduced by. In the first verse, for the servant of Adonai, for David, who spoke to Adonai the words of the song in the day that Adonai saved him from the palm of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. But even that is subject to interpretation. For in the second book of Samuel, this psalm appears as chapter 22 out of 24 chapters, which is to say, it appears, at least in the flow of the book of Samuel, as toward the end of Samuel's life. And so commentators will say, some, that this is a reference to Saul because Saul was the consummate enemy of David, and this is the song of summing up of his life. And Saul was not only a physical threat, but he was a spiritual threat for classic commentators because Saul was a righteous man. Others, however, in the classic mode of commentators would say, no, This psalm was written when he was a young king. This was among his first songs. But as his life was filled with battle, he would repeat this psalm throughout his life. And so in the book of Samuel, it becomes the consummate retelling of his life, but was written much earlier. And as the nature of trying to date psalms, there is no way to know. In addition, there is no way to know because Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, where the same words are presented, we don't necessarily know which came first, though I'm going to give you a hint, only because it makes me happy to share this. The second verse, and he said, this is David, Er chamcha Adonai chiski, I love you unconditionally, my strength. That word, Er chamcha, remarkably, is Aramaic, not Hebrew. It's the only time that Aramaic word appears in the Bible. Many translated as I adore you. In the love your neighbor as yourself, Onkelos, the Aramaic translator, translates love as Er chamcha. So therefore, in many classic translations like Art Scroll, it's translated as I love. I translated it as I love you unconditionally. I use the word unconditionally because rechem, the root, is womb, and a mother's love, for Erich Fromm, the great psychologist, is defined as unconditional love in contrast to a father's love, which is conditional. So I took the liberty to translate it, I love you unconditionally. But back to dating, when you find an Aramaic word, you have to pause to say, well, when did Aramaic start to enter into the Bible? And so a little bit about Aramaic, and then I'll get into the psalm. Aramaic, Old Aramaic, was the language of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the 8th century before the Common Era. It became part of Hebrew largely with the 6th century before the Common Era, which means 400 years after David. We find it appearing in the book of Daniel and in the book of Ezra. Of the 23,000 verses in the Bible, 250 are in Aramaic. Those again are the book of Daniel and in Ezra. Darius, the great Babylonian ruler of the 500 before the Common Era, made Aramaic the official language of the western half of his empire, which is only to say that when you want to date as a scholar, when was something written, you look for clues like an Aramaic word. That's called philology, which is the archaeology of language, which is like archaeology, right? So if you're digging in Israel and you find a piece of glass next to a coin, and you can, from the coin's image, you know when the coin was minted, you know the glass must be, at least from before that time or before the coin. So with the Aramaic thrown in here, you know that at least it was edited. Doesn't mean that the whole psalm was written, but that it was edited at a later time than the time of King David. So that's a little bit about Psalm 18, 51 verses. It can be divided. I'm going to read it. That's going to take time because it's 51 verses. It can be divided into the following 4 components. So just to orient you, as I read it to you, the thing I invite you to do is listen to the imageries And there too, the rabbis, the scholars will debate. And here's what they're debating. Are these images of God as warrior, which are graphic metaphors, are they only metaphors? Or, as my friend Rabbi Martin Cohen in his analysis says, is it a description of a dream of the Psalter in which the Psalter sees himself drowning and being saved from God? So that's one question. Is this a victory psalm of God the Almighty, or is this a working through of a near-death experience for the Psalter that is transformative? Keep that in the back of your mind as you listen to the images. Whenever one reads a biblical text about deliverance, you have to, of course, keep in mind Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, because that song of redemption in reaching the shores of freedom are filled with God as warrior and metaphors. And you'll find touches of that here in this psalm as well, including the revealing of the lowest waters, as if the waters are parting. In fact, Rashi, the classic biblical commentator of the 11th century, will say that's what the Psalter is referring to, the Song of the Sea moment of the creating of that dry land. So put in the back of your mind also that this psalm, this soaring psalm of deliverance, has echoes of Exodus 15. This song is called by a distinctive name in classical rabbinic tradition. It's called Shirat David, the song of David, the consummate song of David's victory. And here too, one last thought, and that is, well, let me divide the psalm, and then the last thought will be this shift between God's deliverance and the second half of the psalm, which is God's empowerment of David as warrior. And there's a very distinctive from addressing God as the mighty to the second half, that which focuses on David's own empowerment, to referring to God repeatedly as you. And you can almost feel David's feeling of empowerment in addressing God in the second person repeatedly. So here's a divide of what is a large canvas. Verses 1 to 4 are praise for God as deliverer. Verses 5 to 20, that's a pretty big chunk, is what could either be viewed as a near-death experience or vivid imagery of God's salvation. 21 to 25 is kind of remarkable, and that is, it's a description of David's personal merit, unusual for what is in the Bible usually a mindset of humility. Verses 21 to 25 is his merit. And then the largest chunk, verses 26 to 46, those 20 verses, are both praise and empowerment. It's about the might that God has given to David. And the inclusio, the closing frame, verses 47 to 51, parallel verses 1 to 4. And there's so many words that verses 1 to 4 and the last 5 verses have in common as the frame. And as a frame, the image that comes to mind, for such a big psalm, you need a very big frame. Normally, we've seen the frame is like the opening verse and the closing verse may have a word in common, like tzaddik in Psalm 17. Here there's 6 words repeated in the opening and the closing. So again, a very thick frame for this soaring psalm of deliverance. With that, I invite you to kind of take it in as a reading. I'll try to do it with some dramatic rhythm so that you can allow yourself to hear the words, which I will add, I'm always adding, that in the Hebrew, in this psalm in particular, there's a lot of both word plays and plays of sound. So even though words will mean different things, there'll be a lot, I'll show some of those to you, kind of this rhythmic feeling of repeating sounds. But first, a reading in English so that you can feel the celebration and the power of the images. I want to thank Eric for all his help on my repeated tweaks. I keep tweaking this endlessly, but here we go. For the conductor, for the servant of Adonai, for David, who spoke to Adonai the words of this song in the day that Adonai saved him from the palm of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you unconditionally, Adonai, my strength. Adonai is my crag and my fortress and my deliverer, my divinity, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and my horn of salvation, my high tower. With praise I cry out to Adonai, and from my enemies I am saved. The cords of death wrapped around me, and the torrents of Belial assailed me. The cords of Sheol surrounded me. I was confronted by the snares of death. In my distress, I called out to Adonai. To my God I cried. From holy sanctuary my voice was heard, and my cry came before the divine into God's ears. The earth did shake and quake, and the foundations of the mountains trembled and were shaken, because God was angry. Smoke rose in God's nostrils, devouring fire from God's mouth. Coals flamed forth from God, and God tilted the heavens and descended. And a thick fog was under God's feet, and God mounted upon a cherub and flew, soaring upon the wings of the wind. God made darkness the secret place. Encircling God sheltered darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From brilliance before God, there passed through thick clouds hailstones and coals of fire. And Adonai thundered in the heavens, and the Most High gave forth voice, hailstones and coals of fire. And God sent out arrows and scattered them, and shot forth lightning and confounded them. And the channels of waters were exposed, and the foundations of the world were revealed at your rebuke. Adonai, from the blast of the breath of your nostrils, God reached from on high, took me, pulled me out of the mighty waters, saving me from my strong enemy and from those who hate me, for they were too powerful for me. They confronted me on a day of calamity. But Adonai was a support for me, taking me into a wide open space, setting me free, because God desires me. Adonai benefited me according to my righteousness, according to the purity of my hands. God rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of Adonai and have not betrayed my God. For all God's ordinances are before me, and God's statutes I do not turn away from me. And I am wholehearted with God. And I guarded myself from my sinfulness, and Adonai rewarded me for my righteousness, for the purity of my hands in God's eyes. With merciful, you deal mercifully. With the wholehearted person, you show yourself wholeheartedly. With the pure, you act purely, and with the obstinate, you are wily. For you rescue afflicted people, and those with haughty eyes you cast down. For you light up my lamp, Adonai, my God, illuminates my darkness. For with you I can outrun a battalion, and with my God I can scale a wall. As for divinity, God's way is wholehearted. The word of Adonai is refined, the shield to all those that take refuge in God. For who is God except Adonai? And who is a rock? Only our God, the divine that girds me with valor and makes my way wholehearted, who makes my feet like a deer's and stands me upon high places, who trained my hands for war, having made my arms bend a bow of bronze. And you have given me your shield of deliverance. Your right hand aids me, and your humility has made me increasingly great. You lengthen my stride beneath me, and my ankles do not trip. I shall pursue my enemies and overtake them. I shall turn back until they are consumed. I shall smash them so that they are unable to rise. They will fall beneath my feet. And you gird me with the courage for war, making those who arise against me bow beneath me. You have made my enemies present their necks to me, and those that hate me I have demolished. They shall cry out, but none shall deliver, even to Adonai, who will not respond to them. I shall grind them up as wind-swept dust. As muck on the streets, I shall tread on them. You shall rescue me from people's quarrels. You shall place me at the head of nations. The people whom I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear me, they shall obey me. Aliens shall cower before me. Aliens shall wither and come trembling out of their fortresses. Adonai lives. Blessed is my rock. Exalted is my God, my deliverer. The divine who grants revenge for me, who subdues nations beneath me, who delivers me from my enemies, who uplifts me above those who rise against me, who from the violent individual you save me. Therefore, I give thanks to you among the nations, Adonai, and to your name I sing hymns, making great rescues of God's king, keeping faith with God's anointed, with David and his seed forever. Some comments in the 5 minutes, and then we're only have about 6 or 7 minutes to get to the 10:30 point. So tomorrow I will leave the 10 minutes at the end after reviewing David's life in Samuel and also doing a little bit more close reading on this psalm. But some closing things to point out. Verse 51 ends with David, just like verse 1 began with David. This is the only psalm that mentions David both at the beginning and distinctly at the end. And again, this is called Shirat HaDavid, the Song of David. And there's a sense of this being deeply personal. The number of times the word me and my is repeated over and over conveys this as a personal expression of salvation. And of course, the turning point for this psalm is the image of that the psalmist is in waters as if drowning, and then God reaches down from on high. Verse 17, Yishlach mimarom, God reached from on high, Yikacheni, took me, Yamsheni mimayim rabim, drew me out of the mighty waters, saving me from my strong enemy. And so this 17, that verse 17, that's the turning point where what's described, beginning with verse 5, is the sense of David being surrounded by the cords of death, in which David is as if drowning when God reaches down. Verse 16, and the channels of water were exposed, and the foundations of the world were revealed at your rebuke, Adonai, from the blast of the breath of your nostrils. took me out from the mighty waters. What's clear is that this event, and it feels like an event in David's life, was a turning point for him to feel empowered by God. And again, there's that unique or rare description of David's expressing a sense of his purity and saying, God, you desire me because I'm good. And you have, as a result, saved me. But then there's that turn. And the turn is this continued description of David's might, that David can bend the bow of bronze, that God has given David enormous strength. And so that leaves one with this question, which is a tension, which is the turning point here David's finding his own strength, his own self-worth, or is this simply a psalm of God's power, of God's deliverance, or is it both? And clearly it seems to be both. David as a psalter has this deep yearning for God, this deep reliance on God, and at the same time, it's David whose life is that of a warrior. So let me foreshadow a little bit of tomorrow, which is the close look at David as king. David in his life will spend his life in battle. He's not the first king. The first king is King Saul. King Saul will be in enormous pain, some kind of inability to sleep at night. And the idea will be floated, maybe if we had a musician who could sing to you, you would find calm. And so in the first book of Samuel, chapter 16, David is identified as a young musician and brought to Saul, chapter 16, and is able to soothe Saul's spirit. It's the next chapter 17 of the first book of Samuel that Goliath, the Philistine, is threatening the Israelites. And David says, I want to go to fight him. And the king, Saul, says, you're only a boy. You have no place in battle. And David says to Saul, but I can do this. And Saul then is so supportive of this young musician that Saul himself gives him his own battle gear, the helmet and the frontal breastplate, and dresses David himself with this apparently large, clunky armor to go into battle against Goliath. And of course, David is victorious, but that battle, chapters 16 and 17 of the first book of Samuel, foreshadow David in the second book as king and as poet. And so David becomes for us the symbol of yearning and singing to God. Close to half the Psalms are identified with David. Tomorrow, to be continued, we will enter into the life of David and we'll look at some of the differences between the Song of David in chapter 22 of the second book, again, 2 chapters before the end of the description of the book of Samuel, their song marking a summation of David's life. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope to see you tomorrow, 10 o'clock, same time, more time with David. Thank you.